At roughly midnight on August 24th, a public aviation warning over Iran's Semnan region signaled that missile firing would take place inside a restricted window, over territory already associated with some of the most sensitive parts of Iran's missile and space launch infrastructure. Not an announced intercontinental missile test, not a confirmed hypersonic strike weapon, a controlled launch window in a known development corridor with one critical detail missing from the public record. Tehran did not tell the outside world exactly what it was testing. And that is the real story. Iran appears to be putting a missile configuration into the air while forcing American and allied intelligence services to reconstruct the weapon from fragments. Radar tracks, infrared signatures, launch timing, trajectory shape, telemetry clues, and whatever satellite imagery becomes available afterward. I'm going to walk you through exactly what we can confirm, why the flight profile matters more than the name painted on the missile, and why the next several days could tell us whether this was routine signaling or the beginning of a much more dangerous shift in Iran's strike capability. Stay with me for all of it. My job here is not to sell you a dramatic label before the evidence supports it. The public record confirms that Iran retains a large and diverse missile force, that U.S. forces have faced Iranian ballistic missile attacks during the current confrontation, and that fresh missile-related activity has been reported around Semnan and the Strait of Hormuz. What is not publicly confirmed is the identity, full range, payload, guidance package, or final trajectory of a brand new Iranian missile from this latest test window. Some reports may turn out to describe a new weapon. Some may describe a modified version of an existing system, and some details may remain classified for years. So, throughout this analysis, I will separate confirmed facts, reported but unverified claims, and professional interpretation. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. Let's get into it. To understand why one unidentified launch can make defense planners pay attention, you have to understand how missile defense actually works, because the danger is not created by a missile simply being fast. A defender first has to detect the launch, classify what kind of object is rising, establish a reliable track, estimate the predicted impact point, determine whether the track is real or a decoy or debris, choose the right interceptor layer, authorize an engagement, launch at the right moment, and then preserve enough additional interceptors for whatever comes behind it. Every one of those steps depends on time. Time depends on geometry. Geometry depends on the missile's trajectory, propulsion, maneuvering behavior, altitude, and where the launcher was positioned when it fired. Change those variables, and a defense architecture that looked comfortable on a briefing slide can suddenly become much tighter in the real world. That is why the phrase hypersonic missile often distracts people from the more important question. Almost every ballistic missile becomes hypersonic during part of its flight. Speed alone is not the magic trick. The harder problem is uncertainty. A predictable ballistic arc gives radars and command networks something they can model. A missile that flies a depressed trajectory, changes direction late, releases penetration aids, separates into an unusual re-entry vehicle, or approaches from an unexpected azimuth can force the defender to solve the same problem with less warning and more ambiguity. That is not the same as saying the missile is unstoppable. It means the defender may have fewer good decisions and less time to make them. Iran has spent decades building exactly the kind of force that can exploit that pressure. The Center for Strategic and International Studies describes Iran as possessing the largest and most diverse missile arsenal in the Middle East, including short, medium, and longer-range ballistic systems, as well as land attack and anti-ship cruise missiles. Many of the most militarily useful Iranian weapons are road mobile, which matters because a launcher that can leave a fixed base, hide under camouflage, move at night, fire, and relocate forces the opposing side to hunt a moving target rather than destroy a single permanent site. Solid-fueled systems add another layer because they can generally be prepared more quickly than older liquid-fueled missiles, reducing the amount of visible pre-launch activity that intelligence services can exploit. Here is the piece almost nobody's explaining correctly. Iran does not need a missile that can hit New York or Washington to create a strategic problem for the United States. In fact, public assessments still do not confirm that Iran has tested or deployed a missile capable of striking the continental United States. The immediate American vulnerability is regional. More than 50,000 U.S. personnel have been operating across the Middle East during the current crisis, and American bases, airfields, logistics hubs, ports, radars, fuel farms, command centers, and ships sit inside the reach of different categories of Iranian weapons. The center of gravity is not necessarily the American homeland. It is the network that allows the United States to project power into the Gulf and defend allies while keeping shipping moving through the Strait of Hormuz. That network is powerful, but it is not one shield. It is a stack of overlapping systems. Aegis-equipped U.S. Navy ships can detect and track ballistic missiles and engage certain threats with standard missiles. THAAD is designed to destroy ballistic missiles in the terminal phase at high altitude, inside or just outside the atmosphere. Patriot PAC-3 provides a lower-tier layer against short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and other air-breathing threats. Space sensors and forward radars provide warning and tracking data. Command and control networks attempt to connect those sensors to the shooter with the best geometry. In theory, the layers create multiple chances to kill an incoming missile. In practice, every shot consumes an interceptor, every radar has a field of view, every battery protects a finite area, and every commander has to decide whether the next object on the scope is the main threat or merely the first part of a larger raid. That is the recontextualizing surprise. Missile defense is not only a contest between one offensive missile and one defensive interceptor. It is an inventory contest, a timing contest, and a discrimination contest at the same time. A relatively inexpensive attacker can force a defender to fire multiple expensive interceptors, reposition scarce batteries, keep aircraft on alert, disperse personnel, and close airspace. If the attacker mixes ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and decoys, the defender may have to solve several completely different flight profiles simultaneously. The goal does not have to be a perfect breakthrough. The goal can be to create so many competing problems that one layer becomes saturated, one radar is forced to look the wrong way, or one defended asset receives fewer intercept opportunities than planners expected. Now put the latest test activity into that mechanism. The first important marker came before any dramatic video or official unveiling: airspace management. A restriction around a launch area is mundane on the surface, but it can reveal that a state intends to put something dangerous through a known volume of sky. Semnan matters because the province has long been connected to Iranian missile and space launch work, and technologies developed for space launch, staging, large solid motors, guidance, separation, thermal protection, and long-range tracking overlap with technologies relevant to longer-range ballistic missile development. That does not make every space launch an ICBM test, and it does not make every missile exercise a space program in disguise. It means analysts watch the same geography because the engineering ecosystems touch each other. Then came the information gap. No detailed Iranian technical release immediately established a new missile name, a verified maximum range, the propulsion architecture, the payload mass, or a complete flight path that independent analysts could reproduce. That absence is not proof of a secret superweapon. But it changes the intelligence problem because when a state advertises a system, analysts can compare propaganda claims with known hardware. When a state launches first and withholds the label, the outside world has to work backward from signatures. How long did the boost phase last? Was there one ignition or multiple stages? How quickly did the track climb? Did the object follow a normal ballistic arc or stay lower? Was there lateral maneuvering? Did the re-entry vehicle separate cleanly? Where did the flight terminate? Those details can tell experts more than a press conference. Roughly 48 hours before that Semnan reporting, open source alerts also described an IRGC Navy anti-ship cruise missile launch from the Syriac area toward the Strait of Hormuz. That report is not the same thing as a confirmed unveiling of a new ballistic missile, and it should not be fused into one story as if all Iranian missiles are interchangeable. But the timing matters. It suggests Tehran has been using live missile activity in more than one mission set. Land-based strategic signaling on one track, maritime denial on another, and the continued replenishment and dispersal of missile forces on a third. 3 tracks, 3 different problems, 1 pressure campaign. The first track is survivability. U.S. and Israeli strikes have repeatedly targeted Iranian missile facilities, command nodes, coastal radars, launch sites, and support infrastructure during the 2026 conflict. Yet Iran has continued launching missiles and publicly insisting that production remains sustainable. That creates a simple strategic question for Washington. How much of Iran's launch capacity was actually destroyed? How quickly can damaged sites be replaced? And how many mobile launchers remain hidden? Bombing fixed infrastructure can degrade a missile force, but mobile launchers and distributed storage create a regeneration problem. If Iran can preserve enough launchers, then every new test is also a message that the missile enterprise is still alive. The second track is penetration. On July 28th, according to U.S. Central Command, Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles in an attempted surprise attack on U.S. forces in the region, and CENTCOM said all of them were intercepted. That is a real success for the defense. But it also gives Iran data. Every failed attack can still reveal which radars activate, how quickly interceptors launch, which defensive sites illuminate, what engagement sequences appear, and where the defended footprint seems strongest. No competent military wants to lose missiles merely to collect information, but combat inevitably generates information. The next Iranian missile design does not have to defeat every American system. It only has to exploit one operational lesson learned from previous engagements. And critically, the third track is cost. Defensive interceptors are not infinite. Patriots, THAAD interceptors, and Standard missiles are sophisticated weapons produced through industrial pipelines that cannot be expanded overnight. Commanders, therefore, care about raid size, reload cycles, magazine depth, and the number of defended assets competing for coverage. If Iran can launch a mixed raid from multiple directions, it can force American and allied defenses to spend at a rate that becomes strategically uncomfortable, even when the intercept percentage remains high. That is why a new missile with a slightly shorter warning time, a new terminal maneuver, or a different launch geometry can matter disproportionately. The technical improvement might be incremental. The operational effect can be massive. Here is where the phrase, "America has never seen before," needs discipline. We do not have public evidence that Iran has suddenly leapfrogged into a science fiction capability. What American analysts may be confronting is something narrower and more realistic, a configuration, flight profile, propulsion combination, or re-entry behavior not previously observed in this exact form from Iran. That distinction matters. A modified missile can be more dangerous than a completely new one if the modification specifically targets a weakness in the defender's engagement timeline. Newness is not the threat. Relevance is. Think about a conventional medium-range ballistic missile on a familiar arc. Early warning satellites detect the infrared bloom. Regional radars build a track. Aegis, THAAD, or another appropriate layer receives the cue. Operators estimate the defended asset, engagement window, and probability of kill. Now compress the trajectory, move the launcher closer to the target, add terminal maneuvering, or separate a smaller re-entry body that is harder to discriminate from debris. The defender still has world-class technology, but the decision window narrows. If a second wave arrives behind the first, or low-flying cruise missiles approach from another direction, the air defense commander is no longer solving a clean geometry problem. He is managing a cascading queue of threats. The last comfortable assumption is gone. If this breakdown is giving you the technical and strategic context you cannot get from a 30-second breaking news clip, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. The identity of this missile may become clearer through satellite imagery, official statements, or additional test activity. And when that evidence changes, the analysis has to change with it. Let's zoom out to what this means. The first ripple is local, inside Iran's own missile force. A successful test, even of a modification rather than a completely new missile, helps engineers validate motors, guidance separation, control surfaces, warhead design, or launch procedures under real conditions. It also helps military commanders build confidence that a system can leave a storage site, move to a launch position, receive target data, fire inside a narrow window, and complete the mission without exposing the crew for too long. That is the difference between a laboratory capability and a usable military tool. The missile itself matters, but the kill chain around it matters just as much. The second ripple reaches U.S. force protection. American commanders have to assume that any improvement demonstrated in testing could eventually be pointed at regional bases or ships, even if the system was not tested against an American target. That means reviewing radar orientation, dispersing aircraft, hardening fuel and ammunition storage, repositioning interceptors, adjusting naval patrol areas, and possibly moving high-value command assets farther from predictable launch corridors. Those defensive steps create their own costs. Aircraft that are dispersed are harder to maintain. Batteries that move to protect one base may leave another location with thinner coverage. Ships that stay farther offshore may gain survivability but lose reaction time for other missions. Defense is a chain, and moving one link changes the stress on the rest. The third ripple reaches Israel and the Gulf states because they live even closer to the launch geography. Israel has built one of the world's most layered missile defense architectures, while Gulf states host U.S. forces and operate combinations of Patriot, THAAD, and other air defense systems. But geography cuts both ways. Shorter distance means shorter warning. A weapon does not have to travel thousands of kilometers to become strategically important if it can threaten air bases, ports, desalination facilities, energy infrastructure, or command centers with little notice. And if Tehran believes neighboring governments are enabling American pressure, the missile force becomes not just a wartime weapon, but a coercive diplomatic instrument. Then the ripple reaches the Strait of Hormuz. This is where the missile story becomes an economic story. Iran does not need to sink every tanker to change global behavior. It needs to raise the perceived probability that a tanker, terminal, escort ship, or loading facility could be hit. Insurance rates react to probability. Shipping routes react to probability. Energy prices react to probability. Naval deployments react to probability. A live anti-ship missile demonstration near the Strait, combined with uncertain new missile testing inland, can therefore produce strategic effects long before a warhead hits anything. The threat itself becomes part of the battlefield. And that is the same pressure point we have covered in our earlier analysis of the Hormuz crisis. The real weapon is not only the missile flying through the air, but the uncertainty imposed on every actor who must decide whether the next transit, the next convoy, the next refueling stop, or the next sanctions announcement is worth the risk. If a new Iranian missile can force the United States to dedicate more ships to missile defense, more aircraft to patrol, more interceptors to forward bases, and more intelligence assets to hunting mobile launchers, Tehran gains leverage even without achieving a decisive military breakthrough. Now, let's talk about the global level, because this is where the technology race becomes dangerous. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, the United States, Israel, and other militaries are all watching how modern air and missile defenses perform under saturation, deception, electronic warfare, and mixed attacks. Every intercept produces lessons for the defender. Every leak-through produces lessons for the attacker. Every radar signature, engagement sequence, and battle damage image becomes data. War is accelerating the feedback loop between offensive missile design and defensive interception. That means the next generation of weapons is being shaped not by theory alone, but by combat observations collected in near real time. For Washington, the nightmare scenario is not one miraculous Iranian missile that suddenly defeats the entire American defense system. It is a cheaper and more repeatable combination: mobile solid-fueled ballistic missiles to compress warning, cruise missiles to approach below some radar horizons, drones to clutter the air picture, anti-ship weapons to push naval forces outward, cyber operations to disrupt infrastructure, and salvos large enough to force difficult inventory decisions. None of those elements is individually new. The danger comes from combining them at scale and timing them so the defender cannot optimize against all of them at once. That is why serious missile defense planners do not need to panic in the emotional sense to be deeply concerned. They calculate. They rerun models. They ask whether the radar saw the object early enough. They compare predicted and actual trajectories. They examine whether the re-entry vehicle maneuvered. They inspect the launcher's thermal signature. They estimate how many systems Iran could manufacture each month. They ask whether a test article used materials or motors previously associated with the space program. And then they ask the hardest question: if this was only a test, what does the operational version look like when it is launched in a raid with 20 other objects at the same time? There is another reason this matters politically. A missile test can change negotiations, even when the missile never enters service. The United States may read the launch as evidence that pressure is failing to halt Iran's military development. Iran may read the same launch as proof that it can absorb strikes and keep rebuilding. Gulf states may see it as a warning not to align too closely with Washington. Israel may see it as an argument for additional preemptive action against production sites. China and Russia may see an opportunity to expand technical, diplomatic, or economic leverage. One launch can therefore produce multiple interpretations, and those interpretations can become more dangerous than the engineering reality if each side assumes the worst intentions of the other. This is not deterrence in a stable textbook environment. It is deterrence under damaged infrastructure, active sanctions, intermittent strikes, contested shipping, exhausted air defense inventories, and political leaders under pressure to prove that they are not backing down. That combination makes miscalculation more likely. A test can be mistaken for attack preparation. A radar lock can be interpreted as the opening move of a strike. A preemptive deployment can look offensive to the other side. The more compressed the warning time becomes, the less room there is for leaders to discover that they misunderstood the signal. I want to be clear about something that gets lost whenever military technology becomes content. Behind every missile diagram is a target area where people live and work. A ballistic missile aimed at an airbase can miss. An interceptor can create falling debris. A strike on fuel storage can ignite fires beyond a military perimeter. A cruise missile can lose guidance. A retaliatory attack can trigger another retaliatory attack. The human consequence of shortening decision time is that more life and death choices are made faster, under worse information, by people who know that waiting can be dangerous and acting too quickly can be catastrophic. That uncertainty cuts in both directions. Iran has legitimate reasons to fear attacks on its territory after repeated strikes on its military infrastructure. The United States and its regional partners have legitimate reasons to fear Iranian missiles after actual launches against U.S. forces and attacks affecting commercial shipping. Understanding why Tehran invests in survivable missiles does not require pretending those missiles pose no danger to civilians, bases, ships, or neighboring states. Understanding why Washington builds layered defenses does not require pretending every defensive posture is interpreted as defensive by Iran. Both things are true at once. And that is why the most responsible conclusion tonight is not that Iran has invented an unstoppable weapon. It is that the uncertainty itself is operationally significant. A missile program becomes more dangerous when the defender cannot confidently classify what was launched, how it flew, and what mission it was built to perform. The gap between what intelligence agencies may know privately and what the public can verify is especially wide during an active conflict. We should not fill that gap with fantasy. We should watch the indicators that can close it. The first indicator is imagery. If commercial satellites show a new transporter erector launcher, unusual scorch patterns, a different launch canister, changes to a pad, or recovery activity at a test range, analysts can begin estimating the size and propulsion architecture. The second indicator is trajectory. If independent tracking data shows a depressed path, unusually high acceleration, multiple stages, or meaningful terminal maneuvering, That would support claims of a technically significant change. The third indicator is repetition. One test can be experimental. Multiple tests from different launchers, followed by deployment imagery or exercises, suggest a system moving toward operational status. Those three indicators matter more than any anonymous claim that a mystery missile is unstoppable. Here's where we stand. At roughly midnight on August 24th, missile-related airspace activity around Semnan put a familiar Iranian development region back under the microscope. Not a publicly confirmed ICBM, not proof of an invincible hypersonic weapon. A launch environment with the missile's identity still uncertain, layered on top of recent Iranian ballistic missile attacks, reported anti-ship missile activity near Hormuz, and a conflict in which U.S. forces have repeatedly struck Iranian missile infrastructure. The immediate question is not whether Tehran can suddenly hit the American homeland. Public assessments still do not establish that capability. The question is whether Iran has tested a configuration that makes regional defense harder by reducing warning time, changing trajectory, improving survivability, increasing accuracy, or complicating interception. If it did, the consequence will not be measured by a dramatic name on Iranian television. It will be measured by what the United States does next. Watch for repositioned Aegis ships, watch for THAAD and Patriot movements, watch for changes in airspace warnings and tanker routes, watch for unusual surveillance activity around Semnan, Sharad, Sirik, and other missile-related zones. Watch whether Iran repeats the test. And above all, watch whether U.S. officials quietly change the language they use to describe the Iranian missile threat, because governments often reveal that an assessment has changed before they reveal the intelligence that changed it. If this gave you the strategic context you cannot get from a 30-second headline clip, share it right now with someone trying to actually understand what is happening, rather than simply react to the loudest claim on the screen. And I want your view on the real strategic question. If Iran is prioritizing missiles designed to compress warning time and exhaust regional defenses rather than chasing an immediate intercontinental capability, how should the United States adapt its posture without creating an even faster escalation cycle? Drop your take below. I read every comment. And hit like if this analysis delivered real value. The next update will matter when the first hard technical evidence reveals whether this was simply another Iranian test, or the first public trace of a missile configuration the region has not had to defend against before.